Welcome to this special edition of the Emerging Civil War podcast. I'm Chris Kolakowski, and joining me today is my dear friend and fellow Polish brother, Chris Kolakowski, the other Polish Chris. Hello, my friend.
Hey, how you doing?
I am delighted to be talking with you, so I'm doing really well. How about you?
Same. It's a good week so far. Early April, spring is springing upon us. So, hey.
And not only spring is springing upon you, but so is a brand new book, which I was like, we need to talk about your book, man. So
that was nice. It came out last month. It's been a long process. COVID made it longer, but you know how it is when you get a book in print. You've been working on it for so long. You've seen it as kind of this manuscript on a screen, and then it shows up and you hold the thing in your hand.
I get excited to open the box and see my name in print, and I'm scared to death to open the cover, actually.
But there's nothing like holding it in your hand and realizing all this time, here it is, and wow, it's just great to see a project come together, and this certainly was it.
Yeah. So now a lot of people don't realize that, aside from your Civil War cred, which is long and distinguished, you're a World War II guy as well. And so this new book is actually a World War II book that you have literally gone to the far side of the world to help pull together. So tell us about this fantastic new book about the Battle of Burma, or the Burma Campaign.
Thank you. It's called Nations in the Balance. And it's about the India-Burma battles from December 1943 to August 1944, which really decided World War II on the continent of Asia, and also has impact, and I trace some of this in the book, has impact on post-war Asian geopolitics. And part of my research, I'm one of those people, and you and I have discussed this in other podcast episodes, Chris, that it's a good idea to go, if you can, go visit where you're writing about.
Yes.
Because the ground, the place is as much a document as any of the maps, photographs, letters, diaries, whatever you're using to assemble your manuscript. And so back in September of 2018, I took 2 weeks and flew to India and spent some time touring around the battlefields. And it was incredible. It was absolutely, it's one of those where I thought I had it put together, and then I'm out on the ground and I realize, okay, now I finally have it put together and I finally understand. And it was that extra little understanding I needed to round out my story.
And I think about the layers at work there, because these are battles that most people haven't heard of, in a theater most people don't think of, in a part of the world that is vastly different than what we as Americans are used to. So what was it like to have to unpack all of those different layers of understanding?
Nothing about writing about China, Burma, India is easy because of exactly what you're talking about. Even during World War II, there was the British had a supreme command. India was a British colony. The United States was there trying to support China, which had its own war objectives. The Japanese were fighting against everybody, and so just explaining the lineup of both sides and what each national objective was, that's a complicated undertaking.
Yeah.
And then you add in how the areas changed. I mean, right after World War II ends in 1945, within 2 years, the British are gone from India. Within 3 years, they're gone from Burma and Sri Lanka, which was Ceylon at the time. And then within the next 25 years, they're pretty much gone from the Far East, to say nothing of China going communist, the French leaving. In fact, the first U.S. involvement in Southeast Asia starts in 1942 with General Stilwell in Burma. And that involvement does not end until the fall of Saigon in 1975.
Man.
So, and then you add on top of all this, these incredible battles, Imphal, Kohima, which the British Army Museum has called the greatest battle in the history of the British Army. You've got Merrill's Marauders and Vinegar Joe Stilwell in North Burma, Ord Wingate and the Chindits penetrating into the Japanese rear areas. All of this happening for 8 months, just incredible human drama with these geopolitical stakes, both going in and then coming out as well. And it's just, I found it to be an incredibly powerful story, an underappreciated story, as you're right. And I said, you know what, this This has got to be told. This is a story that's in me, and I realize it needs to get out. It needs to get out on the page.
So, and I want to talk to you about I bet you sources weren't in English either that you might have had to deal with.
Chris, since we're recording, I'm going to ask you to ask that question again. You were cutting out.
Oh, okay. I actually got a little flash that said my internet connection was unstable. So I've got to imagine that some of the primary sources you had to work with weren't in English either. So that must have been an extra layer of stuff to have to sort through.
That is true. And fortunately, there have been very good translations of many documents. The US Army after the war interviewed a lot of the commanders from the Burma campaign because they survived the war, and their papers are now available, their interviews, their perspectives. The Japanese, the Army, the US Army also had the Japanese write sort of short histories of the various campaigns from the Japanese perspective. So there were translations there. Some of the Chinese histories have been translated. There's some information available in English in India. They still speak a lot of English in India.
Right.
But at the same time, a lot of these sources, if you don't know where to look, if you don't know where to go for these things, they're not easily accessible. They're not widely available. And actually, I started with a bibliography that was probably a third as long as it ended up being at the end. And a lot of it was as I was doing research, and as things would come across, it's like, oh, I need to grab that, or oh, that's a useful to help tell this story. And so it's like any project 10 times over, because you're dealing with such a wide swath of people that are involved. Putting it all together, assembling all the puzzle pieces, and then putting it together.
So let's zoom out for a second, because I'm sure that some people, when they think of World War II, you've got the European theater, you've got the Pacific theater, you've got some Nazis, you've got some Japanese. And that's kind of what World War II was. And maybe they remember that the Italians were involved, and there was the North Africa campaign. And that might be what people think of with World War II, but this was a global conflict. And you're kind of shedding some light on one of those theaters of the war that people tend to underappreciate. What's going on in that theater?
Oh, that's a great question. And the first thing I'll say is you're right. From an American perspective, this is not something that's really thought of when you think of the war. There were 16 million Americans that served in the United States Armed Forces during the Second World War. 16 million. Of that 16 million, about 250,000 ever served in the China, Burma, India theater. So this was just not a place that people were sent. And if you did serve over there, chances were you were in the Army Air Forces, or you were in service and supply units, or you were an advisor to the Chinese Army, and then a few other related jobs, things of that nature. So it's not a headline grabbing theater from an American perspective. From the British perspective, once they get kicked out of Singapore in 1942, this is the main battlefront against Japan. And from a Chinese perspective, it's an important battlefront. They're fighting the Japanese, who are advancing from the east coast of China, but they're also blockading China to the south. And so trying to reopen the blockade. So it's an interesting difference in perspectives that you see. And, you get into what's going on, and there's a lot of different forces. And this is where the title Nations in the Balance comes from. The Japanese have made a bid to destroy the colonial empires of Asia, and to basically take them over and create what's called the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere. And as part of that, they've attacked the Americans in the Philippines, they've attacked Malaya, they've attacked Indonesia, which at the time was the Netherlands East Indies, and they've invaded Burma to cut off China and hopefully strangle China and be able to finally win that war that started in 1937. So they're making a bid for empire, but they're also making a bid to knock the British and the Americans and the French out of dominance of Asia. So you've got that. You've got the Japanese bidding for empire. You've got the British, on the other hand, trying to avenge the defeats of 1942. On top of all this, the Americans are here. Help China is the main objective of General Stilwell when he goes there in 1942. Help China. That's what the President Franklin Roosevelt says to him. So the American objective is not really interested in restoring British hegemony. It's to keep China in the war, open a land route to China, and then be able to sustain the Chinese army, which is tying down millions of Japanese that then we don't have to face in the islands of the Pacific with Chester Nimitz and Douglas MacArthur driving from Australia and Hawaii to Tokyo.
And
So
I think about,
you put all that together.
I was going to say, I think about the implications.
Balance.
I think about the implications of that too. Um, everyone talks about how tough it was for the American Navy and Marines to go island to island through the Pacific. So all these Japanese that you're talking about that are tied down in China, imagine if they were helping with those defenses as the Americans were going island to island. So I cut you off. So you said that's where the nations of the balance comes from then.
Right. It's this balance, and it's by the fall of 1943, both sides have reached kind of a balance, and it's kind of a stalemate on the front. But both sides also plan offensives in 1944 to try and tip the balance in their favor. The Allies pushing into Burma to open a land route to China, particularly, but also the Japanese, who are facing defeats in the Pacific, realize that there may be an opportunity if they can, because one of the things that happened when the Japanese conquered Burma and reached the Indian frontier was Gandhi and the Indian Congress Party rose up, led an uprising called the Quit India Movement, and that was the name. British, get out of India right now, and this is August of 1942. The Japanese were not prepared to invade at the time. In fact, it was a severe monsoon. The area gets 200 inches of rain a year between May and October. So it basically stops operations. And so Quit India kind of fizzled out. But the Japanese realized, well, maybe if we send an army into India, we may be able to succeed this time. And so Japan decides to invade India. They called it the March on Delhi, the first objective of which is to capture Imphal and Kohima. They never get beyond that because the British hold on, but they're making a bid to upset the balance as well and tilt it in their favor. And that's where that brings both sides into conflict. And it's those battles that I talk about in the book ultimately tip the balance in favor of the Allies. And it's the greatest collective defeat in the history of the Imperial Japanese Army.
And the stakes for Japan are pretty high. I mean, they launch their aggression in World War II because they're running out of resources and really kind of need to expand in order to just have the resources to support their empire. So this is a pretty high stakes decision on their part to invade India, which geographically is not right next door.
That's absolutely right. In fact, if you're a Japanese soldier and you're stationed in Burma, you are about as far away from home as you can possibly be and still be in the Japanese Empire. It is out there. Even today, it is one of the more remote areas of the world. It was a 15-hour flight to New Delhi and then another 2-hour flight to Imphal for me to get there. So it was, it's out there. But when you look at the Japanese war situation, one of the things, and actually the person that makes the decision for the invasion of India is Premier Tojo, who is the Minister of War and the Premier. It goes all the way up to Tokyo. And I document that in the book. And basically how the Imperial General Headquarters is the one that says, let's go to India. But they also say, don't bite off more than you can chew. But they also recognize that, we've lost in 1943, 42, 43, the Guadalcanal, the Solomons. The Americans have just invaded Tarawa and the Gilberts. The Pacific War is not necessarily going the way Japan wants. Here's a chance to try and turn it around by invading India, and hopefully winning a great victory and destabilizing the Allies.
Now, Japan had been fighting on the continent since the early 30s. Why is it that it's finally in the mid 40s that they're kind of in a position where they have to make this particular push?
That's a very complicated question. I'll give you a very simple answer. Japan and China had been on a collision course for war since the Japanese takeover Manchuria in 1931. And then in July of 1937, what the Japanese will throughout call the China incident. They will never actually call it a war.
Right.
The Chinese, it's the second Sino-Japanese War. And that war begins, and the Japanese win some significant victories against the Chinese, but the Chinese trade space for time. Chiang Kai-shek's forces trade space for time. The problem is that Japan is not able to finish the war with China, but they are also running out of resources to keep the war machine going. Japan has no natural resources. The Japanese home islands, even today, to sustain a modern economy, can only feed themselves. They have to import everything else. That's why they decide to go to war with the rest of the West. And when they do that, that gets them to Burma, that gets them to try and cut off China, cut off the Burma road, and cut off basically the last lifeline into China, except for the airlift over the hump, over the Himalayas. And, when they look at how else can we, grab at this slippery opponent that is China and India. And one of the very few places that they can kind of get a handle on their opponent, if you think of it in wrestling terms, is by invading Eastern India. You hit the hump air bases, you hopefully create an uprising that weaken the British in front of you, and will hopefully get them out of India and aid your invasion. And all of this will be a prestige victory that will help you at home in the domestic political situation. And point of fact, the defeat of Imphal, when the news of the defeat of Imphal comes in, Tojo loses his premiership in July 18th, 1944. Most people assume correctly that the thing that tipped his premiership over into oblivion was the defeat of the Marianas in Saipan and the Philippine Sea in June and July of 1944. But what pushed them to the precipice was the news that came from India in mid-June 1944, which was the absolute debacle at Imphal and Kohima. So there's a lot of factors that are pushing the Japanese to make this offensive.
Now, I'm going to go out way on a limb here, and I'm making this up by listening to you. I'm thinking as the Japanese push further into India, this is like Napoleon reaching for Moscow. And like you might get there, but by the time you do, you're not in any shape to stay.
That's true. Especially when you consider that New Delhi is, if you think of it this way, okay, if you put a map of India on the United States, the battle lines that we're talking about are basically from Erie, Pennsylvania to Youngstown, Ohio.
Man.
Okay. Now, New Delhi on a map of the United States is in eastern Kansas. So, and then India also has a pretty good rail network, but is not the same terrain. It's not the same lines of communication that you would have were you to try and move an army very quickly, comparably in North America.
Wow.
So you're right. India's big. People forget that. India is a very big place.
Now, what is it that got you interested in looking at this theater of the war in the first place, being something that is so far removed from the experience of most Americans?
When I was in high school, I read a few things here and there about World War II, and I had become aware of the war in Burma, particularly Vinegar Joe Stilwell. I'd read about some of the Chindits, some great military first-person writing comes out of Burma, and one of the best is John Masters and his depiction of some of the fighting, particularly around a place called Blackpool Block in May of 1944. I read that in high school. It always kind of stuck with me. And then in 2016, my father and I went to Britain to do some family history and attend some ceremonies related to the centennial of the Battle of Jutland, where we had family at, and then also the 75th anniversary of the sinking of the Hood. And while we were there, we visited the Imperial War Museum, we visited a few other places, and all of a sudden, I rediscovered this interest in Burma. It was just, there was a lot of exhibits, there's a lot of information about the war. It was a big part of how they presented World War II. And all of a sudden, I said, I started thinking and reading a little bit, and ended up publishing an article in Army History, and I realized I had a heck of a lot more to say. And I said, this is an important story that needs to be told, and was able to get a book contract.
That's fantastic. Now, so we're going to get into, just for a moment, we're going to detour into little known Mikowski family history. Both of my grandfathers fought in the European War. But on my father's side, my grandfather's brother Leonard was in Burma,
Hmm.
and he was an artist, and he's one of the inventors of Wooly Willy. If you remember Wooly Willy, if you
Yeah,
look on the back side of it, you'll see in the grass the name Mikowski sketched. So little known, we're really getting into the weeds, literally.
I like that.
And
That's cool. That's cool, man.
and when he was in Burma, he, as an artist, he had painted a number of just things he saw. And so my grandfather had a number of his brother's paintings. And so growing up, I always saw these paintings from Burma from my uncle Leonard. And so that's how I knew about Burma, that it was in the war. My uncle had been there, and that's about all I knew about it. And so several years ago, maybe 10 years ago, I read a book called George Orwell in Burma, and it talked about Orwell's experience when he was with the empire and going through, and fascinating travel book as well. Um, so then when you're like, hey, dude, I'm writing this book about Burma, I've been super excited about it because I've only had that tiny, tantalizing little bit of half knowledge in the family history. And so I've been super excited about your book so I can finally understand what my own relative went through in his experience in that theater. So, like I said, a little tangent, but that's why I'm particularly excited about your book.
Well, thank you. And thank you for sharing that. You know, it's amazing to me as I've been working on this project, I've come across a lot of people who have that sort of tie to Burma, that family connection. And the response I've been getting from people has been great because it even then it was called the Forgotten Front. In fact, General or Admiral Mountbatten, who was the supreme commander out there, would tell his troops, he's like, "You're not the Forgotten Army. Nobody's ever heard of you." So it was forgotten then. It's certainly, as we've talked about, forgotten today. And people are just so appreciative and so excited about the fact that somebody's paying attention and wants to share these stories. And there are some great stories that have stayed in the shadows for way too long.
Now, I'm sure that you mentioned you've had the chance to work with some interesting people, and they put you in contact with stuff. You've got to know many of the main characters through their writings and the work that they left behind. But just before we started recording, you told me that you were actually in contact with the son of Vinegar Joe. Tell me a little bit about that connection and why that became so meaningful for you.
Grandson, actually.
Oh, grandson. I'm sorry.
John Easterbrook. Actually, I got in touch with John because the Stilwell papers are at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University. And if you're going to use them for permission to publish, you still have to contact the Stilwell family. And so I contacted the Hoover Institution, and within about 20 minutes, I got a phone call from a California area code. And it was John. It was John. And when I was out there researching, I spent a week out there researching at Stanford, which is a beautiful campus, by the way. If anybody's ever out at Stanford, a wonderful campus. And the Hoover's right in the center. It's a big tower right in the center of it. And I spent one day, I spent the majority of a day talking to him, getting his perspectives, talking about the book project, and really becoming friends. And he's been such a huge supporter of what we're doing, and he's one of those, like, one of those too. He's like, "Thank you for paying attention." And there are some things that he probably, when he reads about what I say about his granddad, he may or may not agree with everything, but at the same time, it was, and he was very helpful in you should look at this, you should look at this, draw your own conclusions, but there are some things I want you to think about as you consider my grandfather and his campaigns. I also talked to the commander of the Flying Tigers, Claire Chennault,
Oh, wow.
who later commanded 14th Air Force in China. I talked to his granddaughter, one of his granddaughters, Nell Calloway, who runs an aviation museum in Louisiana. And Nell was very helpful also. I don't know how much she'll like what I have to say about it, Chennault.
But I understand he's got he's a little bit controversial.
Yes, he is. Yes, he is. But they all let me take and I strongly believe this myself. You go where the facts take you. And that's what I did all through this. Was I called it as I saw it. I looked as fairly as I could, but the response from people connected with some of the senior leaders, all the way down to some people who, like your family, a buck private or an enlisted person, the response I got, people just being interested in sharing, was just fantastic.
Yeah. Now I've got to imagine, I'm putting you on the spot when I ask this, but I've got to imagine talking to these people, looking at these documents, walking the ground. There must have been at least one moment where you just had some sort of epiphany or some sort of, oh my gosh moment. Can you think of one off the top of your head, and one that you're willing to share?
I can actually think of two.
Okay.
The first one is reading the war diaries. The war diaries were declassified at the 75th anniversary. So all the unit day-by-day action reports. They weren't supposed to be They were supposed to be classified until 2045, but the British went ahead. So this actually is one of the first books on Burma to be able to look in them.
Wow.
And in the first land victory that the British won at a place called the Admin Box in February of 1944, at the end of the battle, the guy who maintained it wrote, and he used the cricket analogy. And when they realized the battle was over and they had won, at the very last thing that he said on the very last day, England first innings score. And I had to talk to some of my British friends and make sure I understood exactly what they were saying. But that's such a human thing. It's like you American soldiers talking about it in baseball terms, talking about it in football terms. It's the same thing. The other thing for me was when I was standing on Kohima Ridge and the north end of Kohima Ridge, and I was where the cemetery is today. I blogged about it on Emerging Civil War, actually.
Right.
And I knew that the Japanese came within about 600 yards of capturing the entire ridge and dealing the British a blow from which they would never recover. It's one thing to see that on a map. It's one thing to read about that. It's another thing to stand in the cemetery and look around, and my guide, who's super knowledgeable, could go, and that was the front line, and that was the front line, and that was the front line. And I'm basically standing in the middle of a circle with a radius of 300 yards in any direction. And then you're standing there where the cemetery ends up being. And that was just one of those moments. I actually told everybody, I said, look, I need to take just a few minutes. And I looked around and I sat and I absorbed, and I frankly let the graves talk to me. And that is a memory that will always be with me.
Wow. That's incredible. So if people want to get your book, what's the best way to do so?
You can get it from my publisher, which is Casemate Publisher. It's also available on Amazon, on Barnes & Noble, on any of the online retailers, ebook and in print, depending on what people want. The title is Nations in the Balance, and just search for that and it should pop right up.
And I'll make sure when we post about this podcast that will include information about how folks can get the book, including its title and its book cover and all that good stuff. It was also featured in the March 2022 Emerging Civil War newsletter, if folks are interested in linking to it there. It's a fantastic book, super cool to explore something that for Civil War buffs might be a different era. For World War II fans, might be a different theater that you don't know about. So, my great Polish brother, thank you so much for being with us today.
Hey, thanks for having me, Chris. This has been a lot of fun.
Always a pleasure, my friend. Always a pleasure. Take care of yourself. On behalf of Chris Kolakowski, I'm Chris Makowski. Where I couldn't see, I get us mixed up just like everybody else does. On behalf of my great Polish brother, Chris Kolakowski, I'm Chris Makowski. Thanks so much for being with us. We will see you online and on the battlefield.